Imagine you're sitting in your performance review. Your manager smiles and says, "So tell me about the biggest accomplishments this year." You know you've worked hard, you've solved problems, you've led projects, you've made a real difference. But suddenly, you can't think of a single thing to say without feeling like you're bragging. If that sounds familiar, today's episode is for you. Because talking about your value isn't bragging, it's leadership. And today, I'm going to show you the difference. Welcome to Career Growth for Working Women. If you're feeling tired in a way rest alone won't fix, or successful on paper but unsure what's next, you're not broken. You're not alone. I'm Shannon, a promotion and compensation coach, and this space is about helping women grow their careers with clarity, confidence, and sustainability, not pressure or hustle. Take a breath, settle in, and let's talk about what's really going on beneath the surface. Hello, welcome back to the show. I want you to picture a moment with me. You're sitting in a performance review, or maybe it's an interview, maybe it's a conversation about a promotion. Your manager looks at you and says, "So tell me about your biggest accomplishments this year." And suddenly, your mind goes completely blank. Not because you haven't accomplished anything, quite the opposite. You've probably accomplished more than you realize. The problem is that your brain is trying to answer two questions at the same time. Question number one, what have I accomplished? And question two, how do I say it without sounding full of myself? That second question is where so many incredible women get stuck. I've seen it happen over and over again. A woman will spend the first 20 minutes of a coaching session telling me everything she's been doing. She'll describe leading projects, improving processes, helping teammates, creating efficiencies, solving problems, building relationships across departments. And then I'll ask one simple question. So how would you describe the value you've created? Everything changes. She laughs nervously, looks down, pauses, and says something like, "I don't know," or "I don't really like talking about myself," or my personal favorite, "I don't want people to think I'm bragging." Let me tell you something. I've never had a woman say that because she actually wanted to brag. Not once. She says it because somewhere along the way, she learned that talking about her accomplishments could make other people uncomfortable. Maybe she grew up believing humility meant staying quiet. Maybe she watched confident women get labeled as difficult. Maybe she learned that being liked was safer than being visible. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. She starts shrinking her language. Instead of saying, "I led that initiative," she says, "I helped." Instead of saying, "I developed a new process that reduced turnaround time," she says, "We made a few changes." Instead of saying, "I built a relationship that helped us move the project forward," she says, "It all worked out." Have you ever noticed yourself doing that? I think a lot of high-performing women don't minimize their accomplishments because they lack confidence. They minimize them because they've become incredibly skilled at making everyone else feel comfortable. Think about that. How much energy do women spend making sure other people feel included, recognized, supported, valued, while quietly stepping out of the spotlight themselves? It's almost automatic. And here's the part that makes me sad. Many women are so good at sharing credit that they forget to claim any of it for themselves. Now, before we get any further, I want to be really clear. I'm not suggesting you stop recognizing your team. I believe great leaders share credit generously. That's one of the things that makes them great leaders. But great leaders also take ownership of the role they played. Those two things can exist at the same time. You can say, "This was absolutely a team effort," and "I was responsible for leading the project." Those statements don't compete with each other. They're both true. One doesn't cancel the other one out. I think this is one of the biggest mindset mindset shifts women make when we work together. They stop believing that they have to choose between being humble and being visible. Because the truth is, those were never opposites. Humility isn't pretending your contribution was smaller than it was. Humility is accurately describing your contribution without making it all about you. There's a big difference. One minimizes your value, the other communicates it clearly. And here's why this matters so much. The people making promotion and compensation decisions cannot advocate for value they don't clearly understand. Let me say that again. They cannot advocate for value they don't clearly understand. That doesn't make them bad leaders. It makes them human. Because every leader is making decisions with incomplete information. Your manager isn't following you around all day. Your VP doesn't see every conversation you have. Executives aren't watching all the moments that you quietly solve problems before they become bigger issues, which means someone has to connect the dots. And that someone is you. Not because you're trying to convince people you're valuable, because you're helping them understand the value you've already created. Those are two completely different things. And I wish every woman understood that distinction much earlier in her career. Because talking about your value is not bragging, it's leadership communication. And leadership communication is one of the ways you become impossible to overlook. I think this is where so many women unintentionally make their careers harder than they need to be because they believe they have two choices. They can either stay humble or they can talk about themselves. But that's a false choice. Let me tell you something. You can be incredibly humble and still be incredibly clear. Those things are not competing with each other. In fact, I would argue that one of the responsibilities of leadership is helping other people understand where you're creating value. Not because you're looking for applause, but because clarity helps people make better decisions. Here's what I mean. Imagine your manager is in a meeting with other leaders discussing who should lead an important initiative. If your manager can clearly explain the value you create, he or she can advocate for you. If they struggle to put your impact into words, that conversation becomes much harder. One of the biggest mindset shifts I help women make is realizing that promotion conversations rarely happen when you're in the room. Someone else is telling your story. The question is, have you made that story easy to tell? Because that can change everything. Because suddenly, talking about your accomplishments isn't about you anymore. It's about equipping other people with the language they need to advocate for your future. That's leadership, not bragging. And here's another thing I've noticed. Many women are waiting until they feel confident before they start talking about their value. But confidence rarely works that way. Confidence grows after you practice, not before. Think about the first time you gave a presentation, or led a meeting, or had a difficult conversation. You probably didn't feel completely confident beforehand. You became more confident because you did it. And the same thing is true when it comes to communicating your value. You don't wake up one morning suddenly feeling comfortable about talking about your accomplishments. You become more comfortable because you practice describing them accurately. And here's an exercise I love because it removes so much of the emotion. Borrow someone else's words. Think about the feedback you've received over the last year. Maybe your manager has said, "You always bring clarity." Or maybe a teammate told you, "I know if you're involved, it's going to get done." Maybe someone thanked you for keeping a project moving. Maybe your director said, "You have a way of getting people aligned." Those aren't compliments. They're evidence. They're clues about the leadership impact you're already creating. You don't have to invent new language. You simply have to start believing the language other people are already using about you. I think that's one of the reasons feedback is so powerful. It gives us a mirror we often don't have for ourselves. Because if you're anything like the women I coach, you're usually looking at what you haven't done yet, not what you've already accomplished. You're thinking about the project that's still unfinished, the skill you still want to develop, the next goal you're chasing. Meanwhile, the people around you are experiencing your leadership every single day. They're benefiting from it. They see things you barely notice because they become so natural to you. That's why I often say your greatest leadership impact can become your biggest blind spot. Not because it isn't valuable, because it feels ordinary to you. And when something feels ordinary, we rarely think to talk about it. We assume everyone else sees it too, but they don't. One of my favorite moments in coaching is when a woman finally stops and says, I never thought of it that way. Not because she's learned something new about leadership, because she's learned something new about herself. She begins to recognize what she thought was just doing my job was actually creating tremendous value. And that is a powerful moment. Because once you can see your own value clearly, you stop feeling like you are here to convince anyone else. You're simply describing what's true. And that's a very different energy. I want to pause here for just a second because this is something I hope you'll borrow from me until you fully believe it yourself. You do not need to earn the right to talk about the value you create. You've already earned that right by creating it. Now it's simply your responsibility to communicate it clearly. Not bigger than it is, not smaller than it is, accurately. Because your value deserves to be understood. It deserves to be recognized, and it deserves to create opportunities that support the life you want to build. Not because you're trying to impress anyone, because your work matters. And work that matters shouldn't stay invisible. So, before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one small promotion move this week. Open a notebook or document on your computer. At the top of the page, write these 6 words. The value I created this week. Not the task you completed, not your to-do list, the value. Maybe you brought clarity to a confusing situation. Maybe you strengthened a relationship. Maybe you solved a problem that saved time. Maybe you helped a teammate grow. Maybe you identified a risk before it became an issue. Start training your brain to think in terms of value instead of activity, because that's the language of leadership. And the more fluent you become in that language, the easier it becomes for the people making promotion and compensation decisions to recognize the impact you're already creating. I'll leave you with one final thought. You don't have to convince people you're valuable. You simply have to stop hiding the value that's already there. All right, I'll talk to you soon. If today's episode sparked something for you, a question, an idea, or a realization, don't ignore it. I offer promotion strategy calls where we walk through your current role, your goals, and how to position you for your next promotion or raise without burning out or overworking. You can book that call using the link in the description. And if this episode helped you, sharing it or leaving a quick review makes a bigger difference than you know. Until next time, keep showing your value clearly. You've earned it.